What happens when Britain's beloved morning television host comes face-to-face with a royal who refuses to play by the rules? You won't believe what unfolds when Prince Harry sits down with Lorraine Kelly in what quickly becomes the most explosive television moment of the year. Behind the cameras of last night's broadcast, tensions reached a breaking point that left viewers stunned and social media in complete meltdown. The morning started like any other at the ITV studios with Lorraine, Kelly's signature warmth filling the airwaves as she welcomed viewers to her show. The production team had been buzzing with excitement for weeks about securing Prince Harry as a guest, knowing his appearances always generated significant viewership and headlines. What nobody anticipated was that this particular interview would become a masterclass in how quickly television gold can turn into a public relations nightmare. As the cameras rolled and the familiar opening theme faded, Lorraine's professional smile masked what those close to the production later described as underlying concerns about Harry's recent media strategy. The Duke of Sussex had been making increasingly controversial statements in various interviews, and there were whispers among the crew that today might be different from his usual carefully orchestrated appearances. Good morning and welcome back to the show. Lorraine began with her trademark Scottish lilt, her eyes twinkling with what appeared to be genuine enthusiasm. I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by Prince Harry, who's here to discuss his latest charitable initiatives and his ongoing work with mental health awareness. The studio audience applauded warmly, their energy infectious, as Harry settled into the plush interview chair opposite the seasoned presenter. Prince Harry, dressed casually, in a navy blazer and open-collared shirt, offered a polite smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Those familiar with his body language might have noticed the slight tension in his shoulders, the way his hands gripped the armrests just a fraction too tightly. "Thank you for having me, Lorraine," he replied, his voice carrying that familiar mix of royal formality in California influenced casualness that had become his signature tone since relocating to America. The opening minutes proceeded smoothly enough, with Lorraine expertly navigating through questions about Harry's charitable work and his foundation's latest projects. Her interviewing style, honed over decades of television experience, struck the perfect balance between respectful and probing. She had built her career on making guests feel comfortable while still extracting compelling television moments, and initially it seemed this interview would follow that successful formula. "Your work with veterans has been particularly close to your heart," Lorraine observed, leaning forward slightly in that intimate way that made viewers feel like they were eavesdropping on a private conversation. "Can you tell us about the new initiative you're launching?" Harry's response was measured and rehearsed, hitting all the expected talking points about service, sacrifice, and supporting those who had served their country. But beneath the surface, pleasantries, there was an undercurrent of something else brewing. Lorraine, with her journalist's instincts, seemed to sense that Harry was holding back, that there were layers to this story he wasn't sharing. Her questions began to probe deeper, moving beyond the safe territory of charitable work into more personal reflections on his military service and his transition to civilian life. "You've spoken before about the challenges of leaving military service," she continued, her tone remaining warm but becoming more direct. "How do you reconcile your current lifestyle in California with the values you learned during your time in the forces?" It was a seemingly innocent question, but those watching carefully could see Harry's demeanor shift almost imperceptibly. His jaw tightened slightly, and there was a flash of something defensive in his eyes. "I think that's a rather loaded question, Lorraine," Harry replied, his voice taking on a slightly sharper edge. "My commitment to service hasn't changed, simply because I've chosen to build a life elsewhere. If anything, I'm able to serve in ways that feel more authentic to who I am now." The words were diplomatic enough, but there was an underlying challenge in his tone that suggested he wasn't entirely pleased with the direction the conversation was taking. Lorraine, veteran broadcaster that she was, recognized the shift immediately. Years of experience had taught her to read the subtle signs when an interview was about to take an unexpected turn. Rather than backing down, however, she leaned into the moment with the skill that had made her one of Britain's most trusted television personalities. "Of course, nobody's questioning your commitment," she said, her smile remaining in place even as her voice took on a slightly firmer quality. "But surely you can understand why some people might find it difficult to reconcile your criticism of the British media and the royal institution with your continued use of your royal title in your various business ventures." The question hung in the air like a challenge, and even the studio audience seemed to sense that something significant was happening. Harry's response was immediate and pointed. "I think you're conflating two completely different issues here," he said, his posture straightening as he prepared for what was clearly going to be a more confrontational exchange. "My title is part of who I am, just as my commitment to speaking. Truth about harmful institutions is part of who I am. I won't apologize for either." The words carried a weight that went beyond their surface meaning, and Lorraine's experienced eye caught the way Harry's media training seemed to be giving way to genuine emotion. "But surely, you can see how that might appear contradictory to some people," Lorraine pressed, her tone still professional, but with an edge of steel that her regular viewers recognized as a sign that she wasn't going to let this go easily. "You've made quite serious allegations about how you were treated. Yet, you continue to benefit from the very system you've criticized so heavily." The temperature in the studio seemed to rise several degrees as Harry's carefully maintained composure began to show cracks. His media handlers, watching from the wings, could be seen exchanging worried glances as their client's body language became increasingly defensive. What had started as a standard promotional interview was rapidly evolving into something far more volatile, and everyone involved could sense that they were approaching a point of no return. "I think you're oversimplifying a very complex situation," Harry shot back, his voice rising slightly above the conversational tone that had characterized the interview thus far. "It's easy to make judgments when you haven't lived through what I've experienced." The accusation was subtle, but unmistakable, and Lorraine's expression hardened almost imperceptibly as she processed the implication that she couldn't possibly understand his position. But what happened next would transform this already tense exchange into something that would dominate headlines for days to come. Lorraine Kelly, her decades of broadcasting experience kicking into high gear, decided to push even further into territory that Harry's team had clearly hoped to avoid. Her next question cut through the diplomatic dance they had been performing with surgical precision. "Harry, let's talk about something that I think many of our viewers are genuinely confused about," she said, her voice taking on that deceptively gentle tone that veteran journalists use when they're about to deliver a devastating blow. "You've repeatedly spoken about wanting privacy for your family. Yet, you've also signed lucrative deals with Netflix and other media companies to share intimate details of your private life. How do you square that circle?" The question landed like a thunderbolt in the studio. Harry's face flushed visibly, and for a moment, the careful media training that had guided him through countless interviews seemed to abandon him entirely. The audience, sensing the shift in atmosphere, fell into an almost complete silence that made every word carry additional weight. "That's a completely unfair characterization of what we're doing," Harry responded, his voice now carrying an unmistakable edge of anger. "We're sharing our story on our own terms, not having it twisted and sold by a predatory media machine." "But you are selling it, aren't you?" Lorraine countered without missing a beat, her journalist instincts fully engaged now. "You're literally selling your privacy, your family stories, your personal struggles, and you're doing it for millions of pounds while simultaneously complaining about media intrusion. Surely you can see why people might find that hypocritical." Her words were delivered with the kind of calm professionalism that made them even more devastating, and Harry's reaction was immediate and visceral. "You have absolutely no idea what you're talking about," Harry snapped, his composure finally cracking in a way that sent shockwaves through the studio. You sit here in your comfortable studio, making judgments about decisions you could never understand, about pressures you've never faced. It's easy to be sanctimonious when you've never had your entire life dissected by tabloids from the moment you were born. The personal attack was unmistakable.
And Lorraine's expression shifted from professional curiosity to something considerably colder. "I may not be royal, Harry, but I've been in this business for over 30 years, Lorraine replied, her Scottish accent becoming more pronounced as her own emotions began to surface. "I've interviewed thousands of people, many of whom have faced far greater challenges than you have, and they've managed to do so with grace and dignity, rather than constant complaints about how hard their lives are." The rebuke was delivered with devastating precision, and the studio audience collectively held its breath. Harry's response was swift and cutting. "Grace and dignity," he repeated, his voice dripping with disdain. "Is that what you call this ambush? Is this your idea of dignified journalism? Bringing me on under false pretenses, just so you can score cheap points with questions designed to make me look bad?" The accusation hung in the air like a challenge, and Lorraine's professional mask began to slip as her own temper started to rise. "Nobody brought you here under false pretenses," she shot back, her voice rising slightly for the first time in the interview. "You came here to promote your work, and I'm asking legitimate questions about the contradictions in your public statements. That's what journalists do, Harry. It's called accountability, something you seem to have forgotten exists since you moved to your California mansion." The sarcasm in her final words was unmistakable, and Harry's face darkened considerably. "Don't you dare lecture me about accountability," Harry fired back, his voice now loud enough that the studio microphones picked up every syllable with crystal clarity. "Where was the accountability when your industry destroyed my mother? Where was the accountability when they hounded her to death and then had the audacity to profit from her funeral? You want to talk about hypocrisy? Look in the mirror." The invocation of Princess Diana sent a visible shock wave through everyone present, and Lorraine's expression hardened into something approaching anger. "That is completely out of line," Lorraine responded, her voice now carrying the authority of someone who had been pushed too far. "My industry. I've spent my entire career trying to bring dignity and respect to broadcasting. Don't you dare tar me with the same brush as the tabloids you're so fond of criticizing when it suits your purposes." The personal nature of the exchange had now reached a level that made everyone in the studio acutely uncomfortable. Harry leaned forward in his chair, his body language becoming increasingly aggressive. "Oh, please," he said with undisguised contempt. "You're all part of the same machine. You pretend to be different, to be better, but when it comes down to it, you're all feeding off the same toxic system. The only difference is that you're more polite about it." The insult was delivered with a kind of aristocratic disdain that seemed to come naturally to him, and Lorraine's eyes flashed with genuine anger. "How dare you?" she said, her voice now carrying the full weight of her professional authority and personal pride. "I have built my career on treating people with respect and dignity. I have never ambushed a guest. I have never betrayed a confidence. And I have never profited from anyone's misery. If you can't handle being asked basic questions about your own contradictory behavior, then perhaps you're not ready for public life." The rebuke was delivered with devastating effectiveness, and Harry's reaction was immediate and explosive. "Not ready for public life," Harry repeated, his voice now raised to a level that bordered on shouting. "I was born into public life. I didn't choose this. It was thrust upon me, and I've spent my entire adult life trying to find a way to serve while also protecting my family from the same fate that befell my mother. If you can't understand that basic human desire, then you're not the journalist you pretend to be. The personal attack struck home, and Lorraine's professional restraint finally began to give way entirely. The tension in the studio had now reached a breaking point that made everyone present acutely aware that they were witnessing something unprecedented. Camera operators continued to film, but their expressions showed the kind of shock that comes from watching a carefully orchestrated television show spiral completely out of control. The audience sat in stunned silence, unsure whether to intervene or simply bear witness to what was rapidly becoming television history. What neither participant realized was that this explosive exchange was only the beginning of what would become the most dramatic exit in daytime television history. Lorraine Kelly, her face now flushed with genuine anger, made a decision that would define her career for years to come. Rising slightly from her chair, she looked directly into Harry's eyes with a kind of steely determination that had made her one of Britain's most respected broadcasters. "You know what, Harry?" she said, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "I've had enough of this entitled nonsense. You come onto my show, you insult my profession, you attack my integrity, and then you have the audacity to play the victim when I ask you perfectly reasonable questions about your own contradictory behavior." Harry's response was immediate and venomous. "Entitled," he spat, his voice rising to a level that made several audience members visibly uncomfortable. "You want to talk about entitled? You've made a living off the royal family for decades. Every time there's a wedding, a birth, a scandal, there you are commenting, analyzing, profiting, and now you sit there and lecture me about entitlement." His words carried the kind of aristocratic fury that seemed to come from generations of breeding, and the effect on Lorraine was electric. "That is absolutely enough," Lorraine declared, her Scottish accent now thick with emotion. "I have covered royal events because that's what the British public wants to see. I have always done so with respect and dignity. But I will not be insulted by someone who has spent the last 5 years trashing the very institution that gave him everything he has." The finality in her voice suggested that the interview had reached a point of no return. Harry shot to his feet so quickly that his chair rolled backward, the sudden movement causing a ripple of alarm through the studio crew. "Gave me everything?" he shouted, his composure now completely abandoned. "That institution cost me my mother. It cost me my mental health. It cost me any chance of a normal life. And now you sit there safe in your little bubble, telling me I should be grateful for the privilege of being hunted like an animal by your colleagues in the press." His voice cracked with emotion, but rather than generating sympathy, it seemed to fuel Lorraine's anger even further. "Your mother would be ashamed of what you've become," Lorraine said quietly, her words delivered with surgical precision. The statement hit the studio like a physical blow, and the collective intake of breath from the audience was audible even through the studio microphones. Harry's face went white, then red, as the full impact of her words sank in. "How dare you?" Harry whispered, his voice barely audible, but carrying more menace than any shout. "How dare you presume to know what my mother would think? You didn't know her. You never met her. You're just another vulture who's built a career on her memory." The accusation was devastating, but Lorraine stood her ground with the determination of someone who had finally been pushed beyond her breaking point. "I may not have known her personally," Lorraine replied, her voice steady despite the emotion crackling through the studio. "But I know she raised you to have respect for others, to serve your country with dignity, and to put duty before personal gain. Everything you've done since leaving Britain has been the exact opposite of those values." The rebuke was delivered with such conviction that even Harry seemed momentarily stunned into silence. But the silence didn't last long. "You sanctimonious hypocritical," Harry began, his voice rising to a shout. But Lorraine cut him off with a gesture that commanded immediate attention. "No," she said firmly, rising from her own chair to face him directly. You don't get to come onto my show, insult everything I stand for, attack my profession, and then throw a tantrum when you're held accountable for your own words and actions. This interview is over. The declaration rang through the studio with absolute finality, and Harry's reaction was immediate and explosive. Fine, Harry shouted, ripping off his microphone with such force that the feedback screeched through the studio speakers. This is exactly why I left this backward, small-minded country in the first place. You're all the same, petty, jealous, and completely incapable of understanding anyone who dares to think differently. He threw the microphone onto his chair with enough force that it bounced onto the floor, the sharp crack echoing through the stunned silence. Security! Lorraine called out, her voice carrying across the studio with professional authority. Please escort the prince off the premises. This show has standards, and he clearly doesn't meet them. The words were delivered with such cold finality that they seemed to physically stagger Harry, who clearly hadn't expected such decisive action. You're throwing me out? Harry asked, his voice a mixture of disbelief and rage. You're actually throwing a member of the royal family off your pathetic little morning show. The incredul in his voice suggested that despite all his criticism of royal privilege, he still expected it to protect him from consequences. I'm not throwing out a member of the royal family, Lorraine replied coolly, her composure returning as she reasserted control over her show. I'm removing a rude, entitled guest who has shown complete disrespect for me, my show, and my audience. Your title doesn't give you the right to behave like a spoiled child. The rebuke was delivered with such devastating calm that it seemed to cut deeper than any shout as security personnel appeared at the edges of the set. Harry's face cycled through a range of emotions: anger, disbelief, embarrassment, and finally a kind of desperate defiance. This is exactly the kind of treatment that drove us away from this country, he declared, his voice carrying across the studio. Small-minded people with small-minded attitudes who can't handle anyone who refuses to bow and scrape to their outdated expectations. The only thing that's outdated here is your behavior, Lorraine shot back, her voice ringing with authority. Now, please leave my studio before you embarrass yourself any further. The dismissal was absolute, and Harry seemed to realize that he had pushed things beyond any possibility of recovery. With one final look of pure disdain, Harry straightened his jacket and walked toward the studio exit, his movements sharp with barely controlled fury. You'll regret this, he called over his shoulder, the threat carrying clearly through the studio. This isn't over. Yes, it is, Lorraine replied quietly, but her words carried to every corner of the studio. It absolutely is. As Harry disappeared through the studio doors, followed by security personnel and his own mortified handlers, Lorraine turned back to face the cameras with professional composure that seemed almost supernatural given what had just transpired. Well, she said, her voice returning to its familiar warm tone as if nothing had happened. That was certainly unexpected. When we come back after the break, we'll be talking to local hero Mrs. Henderson about her charity work with abandoned cats. The camera lingered on her face for a moment, capturing the slight tremor in her smile that betrayed the emotional toll of what had just occurred before cutting to commercial. In the studio, the audience sat in stunned silence, processing what they had just witnessed. The crew began the practice routine of resetting for the next segment, but still reeling from the extraordinary confrontation they had just filmed. As the immediate shock began to wear off, one thing became crystal clear to everyone present. They had just witnessed television history in the making, a moment that would be replayed, analyzed, and debated for years to come. Lorraine Kelly had done something that many had thought impossible. She had held a member of the